This is an Empty Closet Radio podcast. Get more at facebook.com/emptyclosetradio.
Hi, I'm Andrew.
And I'm Sam.
And this is The Empty Closet.
The show for everyone, whether you're in the closet
Or out and proud. Or
somewhere in between.
World AIDS Day has just come and gone. It was on Friday the 1st, and it marks the starting of, I think it's like World AIDS Awareness Week. Anyway, the awareness continues because it's now, Tuesday, and we're still talking about it. So, World AIDS Day. Why is it important? And what is it?
So, World AIDS Day is started, as far as I understand, as a remembrance thing and to raise awareness. So, World AIDS Day's been around for like 40 years now?
Not 40 years, no. I'm like, it was invented after I was born, Sam. It's definitely not 40 years. So, no, it was started in the 80s. I think it was 87, if I remember correctly.
It was 88, which means it's 30 years. So I was 10 years off.
Thanks for reminding me how old I am, Sam. Thank you. Much appreciated. There's not a show that goes by that I don't get reminded that I'm getting older every day. Thank you.
Usually you're reminding yourself, though. I'm not usually mentioning your age.
Anyway, Sam, this is verbal bullying.
No, it's not. Moving right along. So 30 years. This is 30 years of World AIDS Day. World AIDS Day is always the 1st of December. And it's internationally recognised. It's a day for raising awareness about HIV, HIV-related illness, AIDS, and about the AIDS pandemic.
And interestingly enough, out of all of the world whatever days, this one is the one that probably gets the most publicity in the mainstream community. So, even companies get on board. So like, there's a certain large technology company that changes their logo to red every day. Red has been established as more or less like the colour for World AIDS Day because you wear a red ribbon. There's, it's more or less the theme. Yeah,
that's right. It's certainly, I mean, we'll get into it a little bit later because, we'll talk about what our meaning for World AIDS Day is personally. But, I basically learnt about World AIDS Day because I stumbled on a massive, gathering, and there was live music and there was stuff being given away, and there was like a little art exhibit in a public park in the centre of Brisbane when I was at uni. So that was nearly 10 years ago. Actually, that was 10 years ago.
Wow, 10 years ago, and probably nothing has changed. They probably still do the exact same festival. My understanding is that back in the early days, it wasn't like, hey, let's have a huge party. It was like, hey, our friends are dying and nobody cares. And the whole idea of World AIDS Day was, let's draw attention to the fact that someone with HIV dies every 8 minutes. And that was back in the 80s. Like, that's obviously not happening now. I don't want to scare people, but like, that's the reason why we had this public health awareness day, is because people were dying all over the place.
Yeah, there wasn't even really effective treatments until the early 90s, and there wasn't what they call a functional cure for HIV, and ongoing preventative treatments beyond barrier methods haven't been around until the last 5 to 10 years, if that.
And that's even if you're lucky enough to afford those treatments. So the things that we're talking about and where World AIDS Day really came from is like, hey, there's a bunch of like fairly affluent, and let's face it, probably fairly white group of people that were being affected by this thing, and they were like, whoa, we need to get on top of it. Let's make a day to create awareness. Let's like do some protests in the streets. Like, they were doing some crazy stuff. Like, in the first, I think it was either New York or San Francisco. I think it was New York. They had like these like little action groups doing all kinds of like weird awareness actions. It wasn't like, hey, let's wear a ribbon and be polite about it. They were like in people's faces.
Yeah, some of the protests were they went to Grand Central. It was New York, because they went to Grand Central Station, climbed up in front of the clock and the board that showed where the trains were, and hung a big banner about AIDS awareness.
Yeah, it was like, hey, you wanted to come here to see what time your train left? Well, guess what? We're going to tell you about all our friends that are dying left, right, and centre here. It was intense. And fortunately, it's not as intense these days. Like those sorts of in-your-face protests in westernized countries, we just don't see them anymore. But there are still a lot of people that are affected in epidemic proportions in a lot of countries that are perhaps not as affluent as Australia or the US or Europe. And those rates are really, really scary.
Empty Closet Radio. Listen to us using your TuneIn radio app on your smartphone. Very smart.
In Cairns, we had a World AIDS Day ceremony, Sam. It was on the Esplanade, and I think it was pretty awesome. I have to think it's pretty awesome because I helped set it up. I blew up a massive balloon.
Yeah, we have as part of the Cairns community always has during HIV Awareness Week, always has like tables at shopping centres and things like that have little education pamphlets, and you can buy ribbons and to raffles, and sometimes they go to markets. So that's kind of the education side around World AIDS Day. But then on World AIDS Day itself, the primary thing in Cairns for at least the past few years, when I've been kind of back in Cairns and aware enough to realise it, has been the candlelit vigil. So this is what you were setting up. There's a big inflatable red ribbon so that if you're walking from somewhere else, you can spot where you have to go.
Like, you could literally see that thing from, like, the Marla Marina terminal. It was huge.
Which is great. Very visible. But as the sun's going down and, you know, the bats are making lots of noise and everybody's out walking the Esplanade, which is lovely. You know, there's live music. There's people who get up and talk about their lived experience with HIV, and then they do a reading of the names. So I find it, I've gone, you know, every year for a little while now, and I find it very touching.
What do you get out of the reading of the names?
I don't know any of the people in Cairns, to the best of my knowledge, who've died from HIV. Okay, so I want to preface it by saying that, because what I get from it is a little bit more distant than if it's people you knew and you love. But for me, I get the same thing out of it that I got to a different extent when I read the names when I went on my Europe trip and I went to some of the concentration camps, because I think that names make something real. Like human beings struggle with big numbers. You know, if I tell you 88,000 people died in the first few years of the AIDS pandemic, that doesn't really mean anything. But if I say to you, you know, this young man who was training to be a police officer died alone because people, you know, his family abandoned him, then that touches you in a different way. So I think that the reading of names is important, both because they're still lived memory, but also because if you don't read those names, it loses the human touch, and you lose that touch point of what it actually means and what impact it really has.
Yeah, I have mixed feelings. So the bit of the ceremony that I get the most out of is where people come and share their personal stories. And surprise, surprise, because you know I'm a pseudo-feminist, I actually really like when they have female speakers. And they did have one female identifying speaker there, and she was absolutely amazing. And listening to her story just gave me so much inspiration. There's so many ways that people can focus on the negative aspects of a positive diagnosis for HIV. That it's very, very easy to get bogged down in the, oh, isn't this a terrible thing? But aren't we lucky that we have some medicine to fight it? Like that, I mean, that's a lovely message. But one of the things that she said is that after she had been given a positive diagnosis, it was like a catalyst for her to like take control of her life and get some direction. And she really, really did a lot of personal work. And I think that her story and the way that she shared her story so articulately really reflected for me the lived experience that of the friends that I have that do have a HIV positive diagnosis. Their story is similar to that. It's like the moment that they were diagnosed, their life didn't fall apart. they knew they weren't going to die because we had enough medicine and enough money to buy the medicine. But what it did do is it was a big wake-up call to be like, what am I actually doing with my life? Can I actually do something that really gives me joy and gives me love and gives me inner peace? And that was just beautifully articulated by the guest speaker that we had on, what was it, Saturday night? It was beautiful.
Yeah, I think that both sides are important, because I think if you just have the positive upbeat side, you take away some of the grim reality, because while it isn't just, as you say, it's not just doom and gloom, and it's not that everything is terrible forever and you will never know joy again. It's also, you run the risk of making something trivial if you don't also acknowledge the badness of it. So I actually really like that the ceremony has both. I think if it was just people getting up and talking about how, you know, it was such a shock, but they're moving forward with their life and everything's going to be fantastic because it's given them that wake up call. If that's all you spoke about, that could be really damaging. You know, you need to also talk about the people who've been lost and the hard times as well.
Empty Closet Radio. Like us on Facebook.
Do you think that World AIDS Day is still relevant today for our context? Because the reason why I ask, Sam, is because I'm standing at the ceremony that we did in Cairns the other day, and I'm looking around, and my peers, the people who are my age, so like, let's say under 30s, are very underrepresented. And I feel from the way that my friends talk about HIV, maybe they're the group that needs to learn the most about it.
They're probably the ones who've heard only the positive stories and haven't really thought about the dark and grim side.
No, actually, the things that I've heard people say about it have been really dark and grim. They haven't heard the positive stories because people are still too afraid to disclose if they are HIV positive.
See, I've heard it the other way around. I've heard people my age who talk about like, oh, you know, it's really a nothing diagnosis. And I'm like, I understand that we have medicine and this, but like perhaps you're not actually thinking about what it is. Literally,
Sam, pretty recently, I had somebody say to me, oh, don't talk to him, he's got the HIV. And I was like, firstly, where are the problems with this statement? I was like, firstly, can you not call it the HIV? Like, that's terrible.
Is this like an official new nickname? Because that's just gross.
No, I don't even know where somebody got that statement from. Secondly, second thing that's wrong with their statement is you probably should not be disclosing somebody else's information in such a flippant way.
Let's look, there's nothing good about that statement. Not one bit of that was positive, except that you possibly learnt a terrible, terrible new word.
It made me so angry, like seething inside.
Did you verbally slap them down? Because you totally should have.
I did actually try a little bit of re-education, but not in like a slappy down kind of way, just in a, oh, you probably don't realise that you're like totally disrespecting like everyone who's fought for the rights that you have today. Thanks.
Oh, I would have been much less polite. But anyway, moving on. Whether World AIDS Day is still relevant was the question, correct? So I think, I'm not sure how to get more people engaged up here in World AIDS Day. I think that World AIDS Day is still important, both because, as I said, it's still lived memory. 30 years ago, it started. So people, you know, we still lose people to HIV-related illness in Australia. Not commonly, but it does happen. Particularly people who've been living with it for some time. So the older community, they lost a lot of friends, they lost a lot of lovers, you know, they lost family. It's certainly something that, disproportionately affects the queer community, particularly men who have sex with men. But it's certainly not exclusive to the queer community, you know, and it's certainly something that mainstream Australia should probably be more involved with than they are. Like, more people should recognise this as a thing. But I think that while it's still important, perhaps the meaning of it starts to change a little bit. It's not just about going, hey, people are dying, wake the fuck up. It's about going, these are the people we've lost, this is how we're moving forward, and this is what we need to do now.
I feel like it's probably, for me, it's almost like, if Eurovision is Gay Christmas, then World AIDS Day is like Gay Anzac Day, where you take some time out of your... No, stop laughing at me, Sam. For real. You take some time out of your busy day, you go and you remember people, and you remind yourself, hey, that was really bad, and we've still got like important stuff that we should carry on with our lives, and we still have some work to do. Do you think that that's a fair analogy though? Because when you look at the ceremony that happened, like, we do lighting candles, we do laying flowers, we do a moment's silence, like, seriously, look at the mechanisms that are used, is very similar.
Yeah, but I guess Anzac Day is a remembrance ceremony on a national scale that's been going for a century. Like, all remembrance ceremonies are like that, and that's what we had a remembrance ceremony. We had a vigil, which is a remembrance ceremony. Anything, people get up and share their stories, and people light candles and people lay flowers. Like, that's a way that we commonly mourn as a group here in Australia. I can't speak for every other country, but it is very common in Australia to mourn that way. And then people go and they drink somewhere and they party, which seems to be the rest of the Anzac Day thing. But I have to admit, totally off topic, I'm confused as to the fact that Eurovision is both Gay Christmas and the Gay Olympics. So you're going to have to pass that out for me some other time.
I feel like that might be something that I can explain later, because I do feel like there are different components to the competition.
Thanks for listening to The Empty Closet, brought to you by 1019 Coast FM Cairns.